Hi, I'm Ajit Lenin. Welcome to the Enterprise Architecture video series part 5. We are talking about the 6-layer framework that I introduced to establish enterprise architecture practices. So we started from the top. We looked at the usage layer where we defined we looked at how we can identify the stakeholders, how they're going to pretty much use the enterprise architecture and what viewpoints they are looking at, right? Which would basically provide the requirements for the lower levels. And then we looked at evolution layer where we looked at how time is a dimension for the enterprise architecture and what are the components we need to depict that time dependency. Right. In this layer, we will in this video we talk about the breadth and depth layer, which basically defines how the enterprise can be broken down for facilitating the enterprise architecture practices itself. Right. So breadth means the scope of the enterprise, and the depth is the level of detail we want to get to. Right. So let's look at use a visual. This I picked it from the TOGAF documentation. So this is basically to get an high level understanding when we say breadth, what it means, and when we say depth, what it means, right? So breadth basically represents the organizational scope or the enterprise scope, right? So how we are going to break down the enterprise into smaller units so we can start capturing the details of that segment, right? So each enterprise can be broken down to segments. Each and an enterprise level component can be detailed into the next level when you break it down to segments. So in this particular visual, if you look at it, so the top layer is an enterprise level layer where we have, say, enterprise level vision, right, which can be broken down further into the segment level visions, right? So when you go to the next level of the details, so when you go into segment details, the vision gets more expanded towards each segment, right? But it gets mapped to the higher level. So it actually represents a detailing of the enterprise level vision. Similarly, if you go look at the third row, it is the domains or the domains of at the enterprise level. So it's a business architecture, data application architecture, and the technology architecture, which is represented at the enterprise level. And the immediate lower level is how that can be broken down into the segment level. So each segment have the expansion of the higher level business architecture, etc. Right? And then each of these segment can have a transition architecture separately, right? So this is just to depict the concepts. So this depth can go to any level, right? So as we go into each level of depth, then we can further break down across the scope of the enterprise, right? So let's go a little bit deep into the breadth aspects, right? So breadth can be defined with two different ways, right? So one I'm calling it a slice model, where an enterprise is first broken down to segments, and it can be further broken down to maybe you can call sub-segments or to any level, right? And then to we can go to any level, we can go to the capability level, whether it's a business capability level or further down into the IT capability level. Right? So the key things to be remembered here is when we slice is the enterprise architecture should represent the enterprise as a whole, right? We cannot really leave any gaps, right? Enterprise needs to be sliced across the breadth, right? So basically to facilitate the depth. Basically, the purpose of breaking it down is when we go into the depth, we cannot always have the entire enterprise represented on the details, right? So we're breaking down across the breadth basically facilitates in capturing the details, right? And the breaking down of the enterprise can be a logical split, or it can be a functional split, right? So basically, or a logical or a physical split, right? It could represent. So when we say physical, it basically represents a business unit, right? So an enterprise can be broken down based on the physical business units itself, or it can be logically broken down, like say in a typical IT architecture or enterprise architecture, we can say that. So we can probably split it initial couple of segments by business by function. But then when we go to the lower level, we can actually take it on a based on the, say, some of the enterprises, they represent applications and whether they are the system of engagement, right? Is it a services layer or a system of record, etc. Right? So we can even break it down to that in that way, right? So it's up to the organization needs how we want to break it down. But only thing we need to make sure is it is consistent, right? And the second model in which we can break down the enterprise is the federation model, where this is primarily applicable for large enterprises where each of the sub-segments are autonomous, meaning they exist independently, they can function independently with very good amount of autonomy, right? So there's no much dependency. I mean, there of course it's all part of the same enterprise, but they can function by itself, right, independently. And then their enterprise architecture evolves independently to some extent, right? So there may be some dependencies, but still over a on an overall level, it can evolve by itself, right? So for those kinds of organization, we can use the federation model, and underneath the federation model, it could be the slicing model, right? And the federation level layer will define how we're going to integrate all these individual enterprises together, right? So this is on a depth perspective, breadth perspective. Now let's look at on a depth perspective, right? So I'm depicting a small example, right? I'm just representing an X cable company, where the enterprise level is the cable company, and then when we go to the next level, right, it's all the individual business units, right? It could be sales, fulfillment, operations, billing, and finance, right? Just for an example, right? So I picked 4 segments. And then we can further break down into the next level of detail, right? So next depth level, where we can each sales will take into its own services that offer on sales. So it could be building the product, marketing, ordering, whatever it would be, right? And fulfillment can be broken down into the services that particular business unit offers, right? And then the next, we can break it down by process, right? So under that business service, what are the processes involved, right? So that's, say, if we take product build, it involves a PLM process, right? It involves a pricing process. If we take marketing, we have a go-to-market or a campaign management, right? So those are processes involved. So we are basically split from the level 2, which is a business service level. When we go to business level 3, which is the business process level, we are breaking down by process. And when we go further down, we can go by business capabilities, right? And you can even go further, but this is just for an example. So it doesn't have to be this way, but this is basically to depict an example of how we can break it down and get into the depth and expand on our details, right? So when we start on the sales, so at a high level, the sales process. When we go into the next level, it gets broken down into we start capturing more details at the service level of the sales, and then we can go further down into individual process level and start capturing more detail, etc. Right? It's just hierarchical, right? And in the bottom, I represent the integration models and flows. It's basically we need to have components that will basically connect the components across the segments, right? So we need to have continuity on that aspect, right? So that's also needed. So to kind of summarize, the depth that an enterprise architecture should cover should be based on the organization, right? There is no defined formula for this. It's up to the organization needs. The level of depth also based on the level of detail we want to capture, right? Again, based on what the organization needs. Yeah. The components to be managed, we need to each depth level, we need to define what architecture components we're going to manage. And also the key aspect here is components at each level can be mapped to the next lower level, right? So that the traceability exists. The very key aspect is the need for the traceability is because if I make a change on the component at a higher level, say if I say that my product build process is changing, or the product build service, I'm going to add a new capability, right? That should drill down to all the bottom layers to trigger changes on those layers, right? So that's the key aspect. So when I make a change on the higher level entity, it should trigger the changes on the lower level entity. At least it should send alerts so everybody can look at and see that whether that particular business components at that level, is there an impact or not, right? So that's the traceability aspect of it. Let's go into the next piece of it, which is the deliverable out of this whole exercise, right? This is a breadth, I'm calling it as breadth and depth matrix. So that this is a key deliverable when we look at on a breadth and depth layer as such for the framework. So where we should be able to capture the depth and the segment as a matrix, where we can define at each depth and the breadth level, we can say what components are we capturing, right? What are the different enterprise architecture components? who are the contributors at that level, who are the consumers at that level, and for those consumers, what are the viewpoints they are looking at, right? So we can look at, this is a continuation of the stakeholder analysis we did for the usage layer. We can expand on it and finalize on what is exactly how we are going to break it down across the segments or on breadth, and also how many levels we are going in at a depth perspective, right? So we can create a matrix which finalizes how we're going to break down the enterprise and identify the components to be managed at each level, and identify the contributors and consumers. And also one key aspect is the viewpoints we captured when we looked at the usage layer. We need to make sure that all those viewpoints are addressed in this matrix so that we know that the ask from the stakeholders is what actually the enterprise architecture is addressing that, right? Now let's look at couple of guidelines, right? So breadth have to be complete in the sense that a component, when I define a component at a higher level, what all different pieces that component is made of. Let's say if I take for example, I take a process, right? Say that process have 5 different business functions, right? When I go to the next level, I should have my expansion or a detailing of all those 5 components. I cannot leave out one and have only detailing for the 4 components. Then we are leaving a gap in the enterprise architecture, right? So that should be avoided. We need to have consistent approach in breaking the enterprise across the breadth at each depth level. So as we saw when we looked at the depth slide, how different ways we can go into the details, define each depth, how we can break the organization, the enterprise down, right? So the key thing we need to care is when I am at any particular depth level, the way I break down the enterprise or the segments should be consistent across the breadth of the enterprise, right? So otherwise, we may not have the traceability across the segments, right? So we may not be able to map one component to the other component in another segment, right? So so one level to the next level, we can break it down functionally, but then all the segments should be broken down functionally. When we go to the next depth level, we can break it down by application, type of application, or the technology, or whatever way we want to do. But that way of breaking it down should be common across all the breadth, right? And another aspect is some of the segments may not need that many details, right? Based on the organizational needs, right? So some of the segments can stop at a particular depth level. Some of the segments can go further down at a higher to a lower depth level. But whenever we take it to the next level, it has to be consistent across that depth level, right? Business components should address all the required viewpoints that we saw in the last slide itself. So when whatever viewpoints the stakeholders are looking at, we should make sure we have all the components at the respective depth level to make sure that those views can be created, right? Now let's look at a couple of behavioral requirements, right? Traceability. So this is, we talked about in the previous slide. So just to summarize that we need to have horizontal traceability and vertical traceability. So when I say horizontal traceability, the enterprise architecture should be traceable across the segments, right? Across the breadth, right? So that basically means if I have a process, right, on one segment and it is connected to the next segment, I should have a mapping from this particular these components to that. I should have a way to traverse from this component to the next, right? So there should be relationships, whether it is entity relationships or it could be a continuation of the flow, etc. We should be able to have traceability across the breadth. And similarly, so we need to have the tools to do that. So it could be integration models, flows, entity relationships, whatever, etc. On a vertical traceability perspective, that basically means the enterprise architecture or the components of the enterprise architecture should be traceable across the depth, right? So that's the key, that's the aspect we talked about, right? If I make a change on a component at a higher level, I should be able to traverse down the higher to the hierarchy and say that what are my impacted components because this particular component is changing, right? We should have the traceability tools for that. And we should have the KPI. So at each level, depth level, and for each segment at that depth level, we should have the KPIs. And again, the KPIs should be traceable. So A KPI defined at a particular depth level should be detailed further down. We have to break it down into more detailed KPIs when you go into the next level. So to summarize, breadth and width, we looked at how breadth and width as dimensions of the enterprise architecture. We looked at how to manage the breadth, whether slicing method or federation. Breadth have to be complete is a key aspect. Consistency across segments at the same depth level. Business components should address all the viewpoints is another key guideline. Breadth and we looked at the breadth and depth metrics, which is the primary deliverable of this layer. And then we looked at horizontal and vertical traceability and the KPIs. Right. So next, we'll look at the architecture domain. Thank you.